I grew up in church. There was not a page in my childhood yearbook that didn't have a church service somewhere between the page's corners. I'm not sure if I learned my ABCs first or Genesis 1 and 1, because in my family, you were going to memorize scripture. Matter of fact, we said our memorized verse before grace every single day at the dinner table. And then we ate. The problem came when I knew scripture cerebrally, but it was never etched onto my heart. And the church that was once part of the DNA of my upbringing became very easy to leave. Can we talk about it? Hey, y'all, I'm Seneca, and this is Exhaled Hope, where we have real conversations about faith in the middle of the mess. No hype, no guilt, no pretending like we have it all together. Just truth that leaves us with true hope. My great-grandparents were pastor and first lady. My grandfather was a deacon, and not just any deacon. He was the deacon. And I had two uncles who were also pastors. Church was all around me. I grew up with a single mother, the oldest grandchild, which also meant I had the pleasure of growing up with a life very intertwined with not only my grandparents, but also my great-grandparents. I was a grandparents' baby, okay? And because they were heavily involved in the church, so was I. I was a youth usher who stood at the door allowing others in the sanctuary one by one while my feet throbbed in my patent leather shoes with every passing minute. I sang in the choir, and eventually I even directed it. I told the congregation heroes every Easter and talked about the real reason for the season for Christmas every December. There wasn't a part of the church experience my eyes hadn't seen or my ears hadn't heard. I watched Sister So-and-so shout every week on cue, and Deacon So-and-so helped the preacher preach from his front row seat. See, I watched my grandparents worship and pray and serve God and his church. And if you'd asked me then, I would have told you I loved Jesus the same way they did, that I loved his church. But the truth of it all was that I was living on the prayers of my great-grandparents and grandparents. I hadn't learned to pray for myself, to have my own relationship with him, separate and apart from my family's tradition of Sunday church service. And then March 5th, 1995, my life turned upside down in one phone call. My grandfather and my best friend died. After I had prayed for God to let him live, to heal him, I prayed like I saw him pray. I kneeled and I called out to God praying, please don't let him die. How could you take my grandfather after he had given so much to this church? My young teenage mind couldn't comprehend it, and I found myself angry. And then 2 years later, the same prayer was prayed for my great-grandfather, a pastor of over 30 years, a devoted husband, a father, a grandfather, and great-grandfather. Why would you not choose to heal him? I found myself angry again with the very God whose house I sat in weekly, singing songs and following protocols as I'd been taught, all while my heart was shattered. And here's what nobody told me to do with the anger. Nobody sat me down and said, take that to God. So I just carried it. I kept showing up, kept going through the motions, kept performing a faith I wasn't sure I actually even had anymore. So, when I was entering adulthood and life gave me an exit ramp, I sped down going 60 miles per hour. Y'all, I took it. Because it's easy to leave a God you were promised or would answer your prayers when, in your experience, he didn't. It's easy to walk away from a church when your reason for going, those people, those pillars, those activities are gone. I didn't leave loudly. I just stopped going. And the honest truth is, I didn't know what I was walking away from because I had never truly walked toward him on my own. I had inherited a faith that was never really mine. Truthfully, I was gone before I actually left the pews. For a while, that felt fine. Life moved, I moved. But life, it just has a way of bringing you to places where the things you left is the only thing that can help you. And I found myself in one of those places. The hard place. That places knees in a prayer posture regardless of your faith status. Yeah. The kind of hard that makes you sit in silence and realize you don't have the words for what you actually need. It was in that silence I did something I hadn't done in about a year to 18 months. I talked to God. Not a rehearsed prayer, not a memorized verse, just me, raw and completely out of options. And I'm going to be completely honest with you. I went to him to make a deal. If you answer this one prayer, God, I promise I'll give you another chance. And I know how that sounds. And I wouldn't advise my daughter to pray like that or my son to pray in that way. But in that moment, that's where I was. I know how it sounds. But I also know that God is not offended by our honesty. I believe that he honors when we're honest with him. And here's the crazy part. He answered my prayer, and then I kept my promise. I went back, not to a building first, but I went to his word. I started reading the Bible for myself. Not because someone told me to, not because it was Sunday, but because I genuinely wanted to know who this God was. The one my grandparents had given their lives to. The one my mother believed in. The one who had apparently been present even in the seasons I had written him off. And what's crazy is that as I read, there was one scripture that kept rising to the surface for me. And y'all, it wouldn't let me go. And it's 3 words. Pray without ceasing. 1 Thessalonians 5:17. Yo, those 3 words, they wrecked me. But in the best way. Because what I realized is that the version of faith I grew up with had taught me what to say, but not how to stay. Prayer wasn't a transaction. It wasn't a formula for getting what you asked for. It's a posture, a continuous conversation, a relationship that isn't paused when life gets hard. Y'all, that's actually where it's built. This verse gave me hope that if Paul is telling me to pray constantly, that must mean that God is there constantly. He doesn't cease from being present. I had never learned to pray for myself. And so when my grandfather died and all the people who carried me to God were gone, I had nothing to stand on because I had never built anything on my own. I learned that pray without ceasing means you don't have to wait until you're desperate to talk to him. It means you don't only show up when you need something answered. It means the relationship is the point, not the resolution. And of course, I'm not standing here telling you I have it all figured out. I'm telling you that I finally started figuring it out for myself. And that made the difference. If you grew up in church and still feel like you don't know God, I want you to hear me. There is no shame in that. You can know every hymn, every scripture, every single protocol, and still have never truly met him. That's not a failure of faith. It's actually an invitation to find it. And if you left, if you're in that season right now where the distance feels permanent, I want you to know that the door didn't close when you walked out. He was with you in the leaving. He was with you in the wandering. And he is with you right now in whatever brought you to this episode. You don't have to have the right words. You just have to start talking. Pray without ceasing. Start there. I wish I could tell you that once I developed a prayer life, going back was easy and quick. That the moment I started talking to God again, everything snapped into place. But that wouldn't be true. And we keep it a buck over here. So what I will tell you is that it took time. It took sitting with the pain of what I had carried for years. The grief of my grandfather, the grief of my great-grandfather, the grief of how I thought my life would turn out and it wasn't turning out that way, the grief of broken relationships, the grief of a God I felt had gone silent when I needed him most. Those wounds didn't heal overnight just because I started praying again. I don't know that healing ever really works that way, but I can tell you that he did heal them, slowly, gently, just the way he does. And as he healed me, I found myself growing closer to him, not because of obligation, not because of tradition, but because I actually knew him now. And eventually, I found myself back in the sanctuary, singing again, praying again, but this time from my own relationship with him. No longer tied to the umbilical cord of my family's faith, this was mine. And as you can probably imagine, not every prayer since then has been answered the way I would have wanted. Some things I brought to him with my whole heart, and the answer looked nothing like what I asked for. And I won't pretend that doesn't still do something to me sometimes. But there comes a point in your relationship where submitting to God's sovereignty begins to outweigh getting the specifics of your prayers answered, where you trust not just what he does, but who he is. And that shift doesn't happen all at once, but when it does, it changes everything about how you pray, how you wait, and how you hold on. Thank you for being here today. If this episode met you somewhere real, share it with someone who needs to hear it, or send them the Substack. The link will be in the show notes. I'm Seneca. This is Exhaled Hope, and I'll see you next week.